You can measure this, by the way. Lack of speed is lack of light, which is lack of knowledge. Okay? That's what fear does. That's what fear perception does. That's what an information war really is. So one of the things I just wanted to cover real quickly before I'm done for the day, and this is very important, because when I was a child and I began realizing I was in an energy harvesting system, and I had to sort of look at, one, how long had they been doing this, and how were they able to get away with it for so long? Because it became obvious to me what I look at is what we call a lifespan, a life cycle. Okay, so at the time, it was considered to be that, just to throw an average number up, what's known as the mean, say the average lifespan is 75 years. So you have 75 years in which a being, a spiritual being, if you will, any being that's got consciousness, that is aware of what it is, and the environment in which it has an interface. So it's learning about everything in its environment, and then it's learning about what it is and the relationship it has with everything else that is in that environment. That's the advantage, remember, of an avatar, is to adapt its state of consciousness to the environmental conditions on the fly through the female mitochondria, right? Okay. So in this particular case, I began realizing, how was it possible that an intelligent being, using basic logic, just intelligence, not the creative imagination part, just using basic logic, couldn't figure out in less than one life cycle how their state of consciousness was being controlled by a predator to break itself free. That's what I had to figure out. Because when you already know these things on how cellular memories, if you will, or reproduction, to produce a higher frequency species or state of consciousness, is initiated by expanding what it's aware of from learning from its environment, which allows for its frequency to increase, which means now the frequency speed of its learning and the expansion of its light begins to realize how it's been held captive. Couple that to creative imagination, it learns how to create more hyperspace, in which it expands the hyperdimension, in which is escaping a lower frequency density, which is mass density, the weight of the particle. So what we're dealing with here is really, from a classroom perspective, is the speed of a student's learning, the level of its intelligence. So obviously, when you have a fear-based being, its level of intelligence and the expansion of its light to be able to use its creative imagination is what? Limited. Which is what? Limited perception. Which is limited hyperdimensional holographic perception. It can't move through a stargate, through a state of consciousness, because the expansion of its own light will not allow for that, which is the expansion of its light spirit body. Okay? So in order for that to happen, it requires a belief system. Okay? So who controls the belief system controls the information, don't they? Welcome to Mockingbird. What I knew as a child, what I thought was what I call Xerox machines. They just Xerox what's been presented to them, so that they're in vibration perception match, okay, with a fear-based predator to maintain their obedience to the predator, because they live in a state of fear in the mirror. So we're talking about a being that is in fear of what it is. That's right. Because that's the perception through which they perceive the belief system that they are running using their psychic energy to experience a hell realm. they're experiencing what they choose to give energy to in the mirror, which is themselves. So they live in fear of what love is, which is insanity. That's why I realized as a child that most of the beings that live in America are clinically insane, because I measured it. That's what happens when I moved through all the communities throughout about 38 different states, traveled through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of communities, taking all the back roads using one of those big map books, which was like a Rand McNally trucker's map. Took all the back roads, going from little towns and little towns and little towns to big cities, measuring the light everywhere we go. So that becomes essentially time vectoring the energies, the psychic energy that is being used to represent the energy that people are using to experience who they are, that they share with others. All of which represents timelines. Okay? So if you spend the time to learn from John Gatto, Gatto, in the books that he wrote about dumbing down America, this ties directly in what I realized and knew as a child, which is what I used to call drip, 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 dripping the information out. So what I realized on a timeline, my own timeline, that what they are going to introduce over time, so we're starting with my parents, which was the World War II and World War I generation, who came out of the Depression. I could measure the psychic energy that my parents' generation were using to experience who they are in relationship to the government in which they have an interface. So, for example, if you go back and look at a book that I had that I managed to get, I had a copy of a civics book entitled The U.S. Government in 1942. If you want to take an interesting exploration into this, go look and see what students living in America in 1942 were learning about its government. Now go look at a government textbook used in a class of civics today, and they will not be the same. So they're controlling the information that's put into the skulls of children, in which their energy is now directed by the information that they're reading about what they believe is the government, that they have an interface. That's how they socially, electrically engineer consciousness. So they realized when you have a frame of reference, when a child is born into an environment, realizes it has a mother and a father that both love each other, in which you can measure how much harmony and peace there is in a neighborhood, okay, say in 1955, based on what the parents believed at the time, you can measure that on a scalar basis across every family that was living in America in 1955. They just left a major world war fighting what? Demons, Nazis, otherwise known as the Axis powers. So it was very much ever present in the minds of the parents that came out of that war what Nazism is, what a dictatorship, what a corporate Nazi socialism is, corporate control. Okay? Because they're parasites. They consume and suck up more electrons as energy than anybody. And what do they do with that money? Make sure that that vacuum cleaner maintains its presence. Because now a corporation can use its money in conglomeration with all the other corporations to maintain the Nazi interface with its slaves, with its energy slaves. So they control the information. They control the textbooks. They control the human resource centers, which are your educational systems, to maintain and fulfill the spaces, the billets in which your state of consciousness is filling up geospace. Their geospace, where you're an energy slave to produce things for them, upon which they use that money and those products to enrich in themselves and hold our state of consciousness as a slave to theirs, which is fear-based because they're predators. So they had to wait for most of the World War II generation to die off because they realized that there were enough of those states of consciousness that held in their memory of knowing what Nazi socialism is. So when enough of those states of consciousness and their memories have gone bye-bye, drip, 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 they introduced the new political philosophies to the young ones that are growing up because the young ones do not have the same frame of reference that their parents did and their parents did. Now the next generation of children will recycle the same energy slave interface that they have with their government, which means they didn't grow up. They have no frame of reference of what it meant to live in a country when I did as a child that a child born in 1990 will never have. That means that I experienced more peace, more harmony, more freedom living in America than they did. But they don't have a frame of reference of that because they didn't experience it. So what we have here is a container, a blank disk. Fill the blank disk with information upon which they don't have any prior information to operate off of. So now what we have here is an empty container that we put the information into. They run that information, which is represented by what? More control. But they accept the control because they do not have a different frame of reference to know what it means to be free. So they accept the reality that they're in, that they use their psychic energy to keep it running because they don't have any frame of reference of what it means to be free. That's how they maintain the cycle from one generation to the next, because the information is not getting passed on to which more states of consciousness are running a higher frequency than the one before. Future proves past. That's how they've been recycling it from generation after generation after generation after generation after generation after generation. And I went back as far as I could. So I realized it doesn't have anything to do with the clothes that you wear or the car that you drive in. You could be running a horse and buggy. You could be walking on your feet, which means I realized as a child, okay, only the costumes changed and the manners in which we get around changed. But the slavery remains the same. Because we're locked in perception to a predator, which is a lizard, the snakes, the swamp. So they do it by choice. So that puts them in a dependent mode, which is why the students in the universities and the high schools don't know any different. And they will reject anything that represents anything that is different because they don't know what it is like to experience anything different. So I translate this much in the same way I did the relationship I had with a girl I married when I was 23 years of age, who was driven by materialism, by money. So I realized that when I was getting ready to marry this girl, she was going to go in one direction, which is matter density, heavier density, while I'm wanting to be with somebody that's choosing to go in a higher spiritual knowledge-seeking pathway. That's why it never lasted. Because the vibrational frequencies are going in the opposite directions. She's going into a black hole, I'm coming out of one. See the difference? That's what it means to be inverted. They invert the mind. What is false is true, what is true is false. That's what necessitated the frequency coming out of the black hole in order to expand more light in every dimension, which is to increase the expansion of light in every dimension instead of collapsing the light in every dimension, which means we're increasing more of what we are rather than losing what we are. That's why an empath, wherever we realize we're losing energy, we're not supposed to be losing energy anywhere we go. How come we're losing light? So how do we expand more light? Increasing the frequency everywhere we go. So this is how they work. So all communism is just the same pyramid. So when you look at all the crime families, for example, their bloodline, lizard families, Dracos, Anunnaki. I put up a schematic on my Facebook page known as that breaks down essentially the matrix, the schematics of all the bloodline families. The Han dynasty in China. They're all related. Dracos. Predators. So it's not just the crime families in America, it's the crime family Dracos in China. And naturally they got them in Russia. They're all over the planet. They set up their bases and all their labs all over the planet. They see the universe as nothing more than a resource to be harvested. That's what we are to them. That's why they do what they do to our children. That's why they live in service to self, which means they don't give a shit about nobody. That was the political system. So everybody believed in a lie when they actually believed that Congress, the executive branch, and the judicial branch was there to serve them as public servants. It was inverted. But people believed that they were, even though all you have to do is collect all the evidence by your own experiences of living in America, what you're experiencing from one generation to the next. It wasn't getting better, it was getting worse. So which means it's not expanding the light, it's losing the light. Which means it was meant to collapse humanity. That's right. Exterminate us. So humanity had to make a choice. What side are you on? Are you what love is in living spirit to expand the light, raise your frequency in which we can all thrive? Or are you among the dead? They're dead. They can't generate any source-derived light. So anyway, I thought that I would share that because sometimes it's difficult to understand how you get to any one particular single point in time when you want to look at the past, what direction we're going in the future, even though with my spirit, love is forever. There is no time. That's where implicit trust comes in. There is a natural cosmic order that when you are what love is in living light, the light takes care of us because that's what love is. We get more of what we are. Known as the great attractor. We're attracting more light. That allows us to move through all the stargates. In living spirit. Have a great day.